So today we're going to do a basic tour of the brain, the structures and its function. And we're going to start at the lower brain centers and go up. Most of what we'll deal with in neurofeedback is probably the top part of the brain, but there's some other things to focus on as well. This will be kind of a rare exception, the way I talk about things, because we're going to talk about things being located in a certain area of the brain, but just keep in mind that it's also controlled by networks that travel through different portions of the brain. So we're going to go a little bit at a time. And ask questions at any point if you have it. I didn't realize this was a touch screen. It's really cool. I wish the touch screen was up there. So there are most people talk about the brain in three different levels. There's a lower portion of the brain, what's often referred to as the reptilian brain, which involves lower brain centers. That's generally referred to as the brainstem, which includes this area here, which is called the medulla oblongata, and this area called the pons, and there's another area right above that called the midbrain. Lumped into that, really not the same, is this big area right behind it, which is called the cerebellum. And then the second area is the main area in the middle center portion of the brain that we'll talk about, that includes the limbic system, basal ganglia, other regions that are very critical in functioning, and that are what most people will refer to as a diencephalon. And then there is the upper cerebral hemispheres of the brain, which have really only developed recently, quite honestly. And the frontal lobes especially, which have developed in greater size, even in the past 300 to 500 years, which is fascinating. So those are our three different levels that we'll talk about. We'll start with an area called the medulla oblongata, which you see very. The medulla oblongata is the bottom portion of the brainstem that basically then feeds into the spinal cord. So they're actually connected and it goes straight down into the spinal cord to control basic motor functions. The job of the medulla oblongata basically is to help us stay alive. And that's really its basic functions. So it controls things like breathing, and it controls your heart rate and blood pressure and your ability to be alive, essentially. So people with severe traumatic brain injuries, that's called a herniation, where the spinal cord comes up into the brain itself. Like when you have a severing of a neck injury, you've probably heard of, it actually damages the medulla oblongata and people die almost instantly. Other people that are in comas have not a complete breakdown, but a dysfunction of those lower brain centers, and because of that, they can't wake up. So one of the other very important functions, for example, of the area right above that, is the beginning portion of what's called the reticular activating system, which travels all the way through the brain up to the frontal lobes, and is responsible for our level of alertness. Okay, so again, in a comatose or semi-comatose state, or people that basically can't wake up, if they're very, very tired and they can't alert themselves, that's usually what's impacted. This, of course, has a lot of control over our sleep-wake cycle and our arousal levels. So people with chronic fatigue syndrome, for example, will have problems in those areas. People with things like narcolepsy, where they fall asleep in the middle of the day, will also have problems in those areas. From the pons, we go up to an area called the midbrain. Area of the midbrain that now starts to be involved in a lot of critical sensory and motor functions. So there's areas in there that have subconscious control over vision and motor reflexes and of motor control. And all of the motor and sensory fibers travel down from the top portion of the brain through the middle portion into the brain stem, and then go to the opposite side of the body in the spinal cord. So typically what we hear about is the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So a message from the left side would travel all the way down in through here and then cross over down here to then get to the right side of the spinal cord to control your hand or your leg on that side of your body. But if you have an injury down in here, it's actually already crossed over and it will actually control the same side of the body. So that's very important. That's a lot of what happens in that part of the brain. Again, this is also part of this arousal system because the pathways travel up into the brain and up to the cortex. So you can have effects of arousal and attention and other things of that nature. It's actually a very critical area in there. Some people link to ADHD, even as low in the brain as that is. Again, in the bottom portion of the brain, for example, you have what are called the cranial nerves. And these are these little nerves that come off of portions of the brain and connect them to other fibers and motor and sensory fibers. So the 12th cranial nerve, which is the hypoglossal nerve, controls muscles of the tongue. Specifically, these functions are very, very specific. And then there's the next series of nerves that control shoulder and neck muscles. And you'll notice the further down they are in the brain, they're more linked to motor control and muscular control. And then they'll go all the way up into the midbrain and the area slightly above that to control more sensory aspects of the brain. So the next one is one called the vagus nerve, which has a lot to do with heart rate and other functions. And you may have heard of, there's this new technique called the vagal nerve stimulator, where they're using to pace people's heart rate. They're even using it to treat seizures for different sorts of conditions. Then you move up to the glossopharyngeal, and then you go up even higher to facial muscular control. And then there's a couple here that are very important. The abducens and the trigeminal nerves are important for eye control. So they control vertical, lateral eye movements, and that the eyes are functioning together. So again, it's very common in a traumatic brain injury to injure the bottom portion of the brain and to then have the musculature of your eyes not be in sync. People talk about blurred vision, double vision, headaches, and some of that is just related to the fact that their eyes don't work together and move together as much as they have. Then you get up to the ocular motor nerve, which is the third cranial nerve that controls, obviously, eye movement. And then right above that is the optic nerve. So our vision, in terms of what we see, is actually in terms of the clarity of what we see. So when we go to the eye doctor and they test our eyes, they're actually measuring the functioning of our eyes, the retina in the back of our eyes, and our optic tract. So our eyes would be up here, that's the front of the brain. And then there's a tract that goes all the way down through here and meets right here on each side. So at that point, our vision on each side is controlled by the same side. This area in the middle here is called the optic chiasm. That's the area where vision actually crosses sides. And then this optic nerve, which feeds into there, and then goes back and becomes what's called the optic tract, then radiates all the way from the middle, sort of does like a little fan around, goes to, and that is in what's called the thalamus, which is considered the sensory relay center of the brain. It radiates around and goes all the way around to the back of the brain, to the occipital lobe, that we'll get to, which is where we actually process what we see. Prior to that, it's the clarity of what we see. So you can have damage on the optic tracts that'll actually damage your ability to see things, or you could have damage after the chiasm as it goes back to the portion of the brain and it'll just damage vision to one side versus the other. Usually the opposite side where the damage is. So the most common scenario is someone has a stroke, say on the right side of their brain, say in their temporal lobes towards the back. They won't be able to see much of anything on the left side of their body. Or they'll have what's called spatial neglect, where they can see it, but the sort of the strength of it is so limited that if they see both sides, they're likely to ignore that one side and pay attention to the other. And then the last one is the olfactory nerve, which connects, you'll see this in a second, connects to, it shows a little bit, not exactly, but the olfactory bulb, which is actually the sensory organ for smell. You can see how that's right on the edge of that. So this travels on the underneath surface of the frontal lobes. And if that is severed or damaged in any way, you lose your sense of smell. And I think we talked about this another time, and since smell is so connected to taste, you'll lose about 2/3 of your taste sensation as well. And the other major area in traumatic brain injury that's very susceptible is right under that underneath surface, because the skull, as it wraps around where the underneath portion of the frontal lobes are, has a very sort of jaggedy edge to it. So if the force is powerful enough to kind of get the brain to go through the cushioning of the cerebral spinal fluid and hit those edges, it'll scrape and tear that underneath surface, and then you'll lose a lot of smell and taste sensation as a result. Okay, so just behind the brain stem is an area called the cerebellum. The cerebellum, as most people know, is a very large structure. It's actually, other than the cerebral hemispheres, it's the second largest structure in the brain itself. And again, in reptilian brains, the cerebellum actually controls just about everything, including thinking and instincts and responses. The cerebellum in humans had, for centuries, has been thought to be mainly a motor control center. So it has a lot to do with your balance, coordination of activity, how you put things together motorically. In the past 20 years, we found out a lot of information. Now the cerebellum is also involved in mental activity. Everything from reading to executive functioning to memory skills to even there's new research to believe that the cerebellum is actually an important component of emotional difficulties as a result of developmental trauma that kids experience. So there's a lot of things that go on there for sure. Okay, so as we move up the brain, we then get to an area in the middle called the hypothalamus, which is just above the midbrain, which is a very important area, including the pituitary gland. They work together. It's usually called the pituitary hypothalamic axis. So they work together in the generation of hormones and other chemical substrates that are responsible for a lot of activity, again, breathing, heart rate, and then sexual hormones and others as well. Progesterone, testosterone are all processed in that area of the brain as well. And there are multiple nuclei. I mean, you literally you can sub-define the hypothalamus into 12 different sections, and each one controls a separate secretion of different hormones that control behavior and activity. Just above the thalamus, just above the hypothalamus, since hypo means low or under, the thalamus is right above that. The thalamus are two sort of walnut-sized shapes on either side in the very center of the brain that sort of appear in the middle, to upper portion of the limbic system, and the limbic system kind of wraps around it, which you'll see in a few minutes. The thalamus is basically our sensory relay station. So every sensation except smell, and to some degree taste, comes into the thalamus and then goes out to different areas of the brain. So touch, vision, hearing are primarily controlled by thalamic inputs, and then there are separate nuclei that send information to the frontal lobes and parietal lobes and temporal lobes and other areas. So it's very important. The thalamus in EEG terms is really important because most people believe it to be the center of the alpha generator in EEG activity. And in that way, it's also very important in arousal and alertness as well. From there, we would probably go to the limbic system, which is an area, this doesn't show it entirely, but this is a large portion of it, and it kind of wraps around in a circular motion. The limbic system has multiple structures within it, but mainly it is controlled with two things, emotion and memory. And they're tied together very often in similar brain structures. So if something is highly emotional for someone, they're very often going to remember, okay, whether they have Alzheimer's or anything else. So one of the things that people say that with Alzheimer's hold on to the longest is how they feel about people, their relationships and their emotions, even when they can't remember a person's name. So that's very important. So within the limbic system, there are a few different functions. The entorhinal cortex, which is one of the primary memory structures that then feeds into what's called the hippocampus, which is, and then underneath that, what's called the parahippocampal gyrus, are the primary areas most people link to memory function and even memory storage. Not that the memories are stored there, but the functions of those part of the brain allow for memory storage so we can retrieve it later. Right near that, we have another, here's the hippocampus. As you can see, it sort of edges up against the entorhinal cortex and it has sort of like a ram-like appearance, like a horn. And that's the really important areas for memory storage especially. There's another area near that called the amygdala. So you can see it's just sort of in front and all of that. These are literally the size of almonds, basically. And they are in the internal area of the front portion of the temporal lobes. So if you went here and in and down, that's where you would find the amygdala bodies, is what they're called. And those are areas that are very important for the fight or flight response reaction that we have. So when we are threatened by anything, in current day life, we're not threatened a lot. It used to be a lot, but if you're in a car accident, or if someone attacks you, or something, for some people, if you see a spider, whatever you consider a threat, either you'll attack, or you'll run, or flee in some way. Either you'll have anger, or fear, or anxiety. So it's considered very important for the fear centers of the brain as well. So now we'll move just up to a general area above that called the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia, again, lie sort of above and around the limbic system. And they're made up of about 4 or 5 different structures. And the main purpose of the basal ganglia is motor control. Or at least it was always thought to be that way. So by motor control, we mean fine motor movement, coordination, and the lack of those things. So for example, there's an area called the substantia nigra. Those little locations at the base of the basal ganglia that are very involved in the production of dopamine. And they're considered to be where the primary source of dysfunction comes in Parkinson's disease, for example. And then there are other areas like the putamen, and then there's another one called the Lobus pallidus, and then the caudate is the sort of wrapping all around it, and the head of the caudate, which is in the front, is actually in the underneath portion of the frontal lobes, and is considered very important actually for cognitive function that we usually ascribe to the frontal lobes, like executive functions. So we now know there are pathways that go from the cerebellum through the basal ganglia all the way up to the frontal lobes, and all of those systems actually control those mental functions we attribute to the frontal lobes, which we'll get to shortly. So a lot of things happen in similar places that we might not necessarily link with each other. So then we get up to the cerebral hemispheres. These are the occipital lobes, and the occipital lobes are generally related to vision. That's what they control. On the left side of the brain, we tend to think of it as how vision and words intersect. So people that have a problem across these areas, kids we see that have problems across those areas almost always have reading problems, because they're trying to convert what they see into the sound that the word makes, and they can't form that integration. On the right side, it is more interpreting form and shape versus letters and words. And now we're talking about things like math and writing and putting complicated visual things together. And the social problems we see a lot in kids with autism are ascribed to that area as well. As the occipital lobe goes along to the temporal lobes and even up to the amygdala, their interpretation of what they see in people goes awry, and that causes those problems. So the primary portion of the occipital lobes is actually right just in that area there, called the primary visual cortex. That tells us that we've seen something. It doesn't even tell us what it is yet. And then as it spreads out across the occipital lobes, like you saw, we interpret the color, the shape, the form, the function, and put things together. So it starts, all portions of the brain start in a basic sensory area, and then the interpretation gets more complicated the further you go away from that area. The parietal lobes take up sort of the top half of the brain anterior to the occipital regions, and the parietal lobes are where we put lots of things together at the same time. But the primary function of the parietal lobes is sensation, that is feeling things, which is in the somatosensory cortex, which is this strip along here. So kids with sensory integration problems or things like that will have problems in those areas. Someone that has a stroke in the left somatosensory cortex won't be able to feel on the right side of their body. So when we do tests where we test their sense of touch and vision and hearing, we're trying to measure for all of those things. And where you have it on this determines where you lose sensation. So your hands and your arms are down around here, followed by legs and feet. And as you get further to the middle, it actually gets to facial sensation and center of body sensation as well. There are other areas in the parietal lobes. A very fascinating one is one in the very center, right under about PZ, called the precuneus. And the precuneus was really not understood very well for a long time, but recently now it's considered sort of like almost your personality, to a sense. It is the center of how you define yourself in relation to the world, because it's your sort of kinesthetic and sensory experience of life. And again, in developmental trauma, that's one of the hot spots where they hold those negative experiences and how they relate to the world, because that's altered. They can't relate to their current world, people, and circumstances, as well as their life. The parietal lobes on the right and left side are very different. So on the left side in the parietal lobes, for most people that have language control on the left side, that's where Wernicke's area is, right in there, which is the seat of comprehension and understanding the spoken language. On the right side, that's the seat of spatial organization. So math is a big one, right in that area. And how you organize visually your world and information and process all of that writing and your organizational skills and all of that information. It's very, very important. We go from there to the temporal lobes, which sit on the underneath portion in front of the occipital areas, but underneath the parietal lobes, which are right up here. And the temporal lobes, their main roles are a few things. First is hearing. The actual sensory aspect of what we hear is in the temporal lobes, in the primary auditory cortex, which is that little space right in there. The name of it is actually Heschel's gyrus. There's one specific area where you actually register that you've heard something. And then Wernicke's area is just posterior to that in the left hemisphere, from the temporal up to portions of the parietal lobe. It's a pretty large area, but it's generally right in the intersection where the temporal and parietal lobes meet. Again, that's the comprehension zone of the brain. On the right side, again, it's interpretation of different information. The right hemisphere, again, controls more spatial aspects, more processing of people and the world and movement of objects and how they intersect. It affects things like math and science and writing, like we've talked about. But not as much related to language, at least in most people. About 90% of most people have language just in their left hemisphere. The other thing the temporal lobes are very important for, because they sort of overlap the limbic system, is memory and emotion. So in the left hemisphere, we're going to tend to see much more negative types of emotion with temporal lobe involvement. So you're either sad or angry. And some people can be a combination of the two. But in clinical depression, that of course we sometimes see in our patients, it's the left temporal lobes that will be very important. The opposite in the right hemisphere is true. They'll tend to be more excitable. So that's where you tend to see more anxiety, or even people with mania, like in bipolar disorder, that'll be more on the right temporal lobe. And then the last thing we're going to talk about are the frontal lobes, which, as you can see, are huge. It takes up more than 1/3 of all of the cerebral hemispheres are taken up by the frontal lobes because of their important role in human behavior. And that includes language and communication, because right in here, in the inferior frontal portion of the frontal lobes, on the left side, right in the center of that is what's called Broca's area. So Broca's area is the expressive language center of the brain that connects to Wernicke's area in the back to help us have normal language function. The inferior frontal gyrus is also what controls these mu rhythms in a lot of the autistic kids we see. And so not only does it control language, but it's very important for purposeful behavior, imitation, learning, social interaction, all of those sorts of goal-directed types of behaviors. So in the frontal lobes themselves, we have the motor cortex, which is actually just anterior to the somatosensory cortex, which is behind it. And now that controls motor function. So again, a stroke of the left side will disrupt motor control, strength on the right side of the body. And again, there's what's called a motor homunculus, which is this sort of crazy looking image of how different portions are controlled by different sides. Again, hands, arms, legs, feet, and back up to center locations of the face. If you have a stroke in the center portion, you're more likely to have sort of facial drooping and other problems related to motor innervation of those nerves. In front of the primary motor cortex, you get what's called the premotor cortex, which is involved in planning and execution of motor skills. And that area then communicates with the motor strip to make that happen. And of course, the basal ganglia is crucially involved in that activity as well. And then there are other areas of the frontal lobes, like the middle frontal gyrus, that's part of what's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in decision-making, planning, problem-solving, organization of behavior, all of those very complicated mental functions. And then the premotor cortex is the critical area of the brain involved in personality, involved in things like impulse control and social judgment. And again, in traumatic brain injuries, when those are commonly impacted, you see those change for people. We had talked about the olfactory lobe on the underneath surface of the brain, with the olfactory lobe is right down the center of that there. But the orbitofrontal cortex on the floor of the frontal lobes is very important in controlling behavior. So kids with a lot of aggressiveness, a lot of problems in the orbitofrontal area, again, impulse control, especially ones related to extreme emotion and behavior will be involved in those areas of the brain. Again, the left side of the frontal lobes involve more in language directed behavior, the right side in terms of more social and spatial directed behavior. We'll just touch on one last area that we talk about somewhat frequently, well, two last areas. One, this is called the cingulate cortex, or the cingulate gyrus, which is underneath the cerebral hemisphere and just above the limbic system. So it's sort of the gateway between the two. And it wraps all the way around from the front to the back. So the precuneus lies on top of the posterior cingulate, and the frontal lobes on top of the anterior cingulate. And very important area of the brain. The anterior cingulate is generally anterior to middle, has a lot to do with attention skills. The anterior, what's called the caudal cingulate right there, has a lot to do with obsessive, compulsive, repetitive types of behavior. And the posterior cingulate, a lot of sensory and attention and social networks because of where that's located as well. And then we haven't talked much about connections in the brain, but the corpus callosum is the largest connection of fibers from side to side, from left to right side. And you can see that lies in that area. The cingulate cortex would actually be right above it. And both of them have fibers that go back and forth to sides of the brain to help us communicate. Okay. So those are the major landmarks and what they control for that. So, yeah.